Hello class. Today we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing integers. So you're going to need your Chromebook, your daily notebook, your pencil and your pen for notes. And we need to also remember that we are going to have a test on Thursday over all of the integer concepts as well as the number systems. Okay, you will have a couple questions on that. Okay, so let me switch to the big board and then I will proceed with the lesson. So today we're talking about multiplying and dividing integers. So let's go back and review a couple things real fast. What have we done so far? So we've talked about addition, and we talked about two stupid questions that you can ask. Okay, first question is, how do I know it's an addition problem? Okay, we know that because it's got a plus in the middle. How do we know it's a subtraction problem? Because it has a minus in the middle. Well, what we need to remember that if it does have a plus in the middle, we've got two things that we're going to do. If the signs are alike, positive, positive, or negative, negative, we're going to add and keep the sign. So two positives make more positives, two negatives make more negatives. If our signs are different, one's positive, one's negative, then we're going to subtract our numbers and take the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. Okay, so that's what we do if there's a plus in the middle of the problem. Now, what if there's a minus in the middle? Well, if there's a minus in the middle, we found out that we change it. That's what we did yesterday. We changed subtraction to addition and the next number to its opposite. And then once we've done that, it's now an addition problem, so we go back to the addition rules. Okay, so that's what we've got to remember. Okay, so let's see if we can talk about multiply and divide then. Well, what we're going to do in order to talk about multiply and divide is we're going to create a little summary chart. Okay, so I want you to draw on your paper a chart that looks like this. Okay, and we need to put up in this one signs on problem. And then over on this side, we're going to put sign on answer. Or actually in addition, in a subtraction, because we're going to be reviewing this on addition, we're going to put operation. Sorry about that. I was getting a little ahead of myself. Okay, so this is kind of like the rules that we just got through talking about in a chart format. So if I have a positive number and a positive number, what are we going to do with those numbers? If it's an addition problem, we're going to add the numbers together. What if we have one positive and one negative? What are we going to do with our numbers? Well, if our signs are different, what did we do? We subtracted them. Okay. Well, what if the first one was negative and the second was positive? Then we would also subtract them. What if we had two negatives? Well, this makes our signs alike, so we would actually add them together. So this chart summarizes what we do with our rules for addition. So if we were to go back and look at our addition rules, signs alike, we add our numbers. Positive, positive, add. Negative, negative, add. Okay. Now that doesn't tell us what's going to be on our answer, because in this one we would end up with a positive answer. This one we would end up with a negative answer. But this is just telling us what we're going to do with our numbers. Okay. So that's what that chart says. And then it says that if our signs are different, we subtract. So if our signs are different, positive, negative, or negative, positive, we would subtract our numbers. Now, I want you to kind of keep track of this because it's going to come back and revisit us in just a few minutes. So now let's talk about multiply. Well, just like we talked about in addition, addition meant to put together, subtraction meant to take away. Well, what does multiply mean? If I were to give you this problem right here, 2 times 3, well, what does that mean? Well, if you remember back in elementary school, that really meant 2 groups of 3. Now, more specifically, we need to now talk about positives and negatives. So this 2, because it doesn't have a sign, is a positive, and this 3, since it doesn't have a sign, it's a positive. So this says positive 2 times positive 3. Well, what that really means is I've got 2 groups of positive 3. Okay, so if we were to look at it in terms of our 2 color counters, that would mean I'd have 2 groups of positive 3, okay, or if we did it with just positive signs, 2 groups of positive 3, here's one group, here's another group, what's my answer going to be? Positive 6, all right? So keep that in mind, just kind of bear with me as we're working this question, all right? So what about this one then? So if that one meant 2 groups of 3, what does this mean? Well, this means 4 groups of 5, okay? So now more specifically, it means 4 groups of what kind of 5? Positive 5. So if I had 4 groups of 5, here's 4 groups of 5. 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups. What do I have in my pile there? Well, I've got positive 20. Right? So that's kind of what that means. Okay, so that's what we got to kind of really think about when we're working these questions. So with that in mind, then what's this one? Let's go back to the 2 and 3. So if this first one meant I had 2 groups of 3, which gave me a positive 6 as an answer, what does this problem say? Well, this one says 2 groups of negative 3. So if I've got 2 groups of negative 3, here's a group. This time we're doing horizontal groups. Here's a group, here's a group. What kind of an answer do I have? Well, I end up with a negative 6. So 2 groups of positive 3 gave us a positive 6. 2 groups of negative 3 gave us a negative 6. Okay, so what about this one? Now this one's got a little slightly different meaning. Okay, so just kind of imagine this 2, or that negative right there is not there. Okay, so with that in mind then, that means 2 groups of 3. 2 groups of positive 3. Well, this negative in the front, what it really says is, what's the opposite of? So this problem says, what's the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3? Well, the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3 is 2 groups of negative 3. So negative 2 times positive 3 actually gives me a negative 6 for an answer. Okay, so one more real quick. Well, what about this one right here? Okay, so this one, now we just said that that little negative sign up in the front says, what's the opposite of? Well, what are we looking for? Well, this part right here says, I need 2 groups of negative 3. Well, this little negative in the front says, what's the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3? And the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3 is 2 groups of positive 3, which would give me a positive 6. Okay, so if we were to kind of go back and look at this, okay, 2 times 3, positive 2 times positive 3 gave me a positive 6. Positive 2 times positive 3 gave me a positive 6. Positive 2 times negative 3 gave me a negative 6. Negative 2 times positive 3 also gave me a negative 6. And negative 2 times negative 3 gave me a positive 6. Now, if you really pay close attention, what really happened was that chart. Positive number times a positive number gave me a positive answer. A positive number times a negative number gave me a negative answer. So in addition, this chart tells us what operation we're going to do with our numbers. But in multiply, this chart gives us what kind of a sign I'm going to have on my answer. That's what we need to kind of remember. So let's see if we can summarize this with the chart one more time. Okay, so if I were to draw this chart, this part's still going to say signs on problem, but this time it really will say the sign on answer, which is what I wanted to put that first time when we drew the chart. Okay, so in multiply, if I've got a positive times a positive, I'm going to get a positive as an answer. If I'm going to have a positive times a negative, I'm going to get a negative as an answer. If I'm going to have a negative times a positive, I'm also going to get a negative as an answer. And if I have a negative times a negative, I'm going to get a positive as an answer. Okay, so that's kind of the rule that we have with integers. So if I were to work some problems, let's see if we can work a couple problems here. Okay, let's work a few, and then we're going to look at what if I have more than just 2 numbers. So if I had a 6 times negative 3, and we know that that little dot means multiply. 6 times negative 3, well, we know that 6 times 3 is going to give us 18. But if we were to go back to our chart, a positive times a negative gives me what? A negative. So I'd end up with a negative 18 as my answer. If I had a negative 4 times negative 6, well, we know 4 times 6 is going to give me 24. And back on our chart, a negative times a negative gave me a positive. So that would give me a positive 24 as my answer. And that's what we're basically doing. So what you think about when you're dealing with multiplication is you've got 2 basic rules. The first thing that we do is, you notice, is we multiply. We just straight multiply, just like we always have. And then we worry about our signs. Okay, so what if more than 2 numbers? What if I had like a negative 2 times a negative 3 times a negative 2. What if I had that? Well, let's see. Let's do this first part. Well, negative 2 times negative 3. Well, 2 times 3 is going to give me 6. But looking at our chart, a negative times a negative gives us a positive. So we'd end up with a positive 6 there. Now I need to take that answer and multiply that by negative 2. So, well, we know 6 and 2 are going to give us 12. And we know from our chart, a positive times a negative is going to give me a negative. So that's going to give me a negative 12 as an answer. Okay, let's look at one more real quick. What if I gave you this one? Negative 1 times 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 negative 1. Okay, give you that one right there. Well, these two negative ones, negative 1 times negative 1, and as we saw in our chart, a negative times a negative is a positive. A negative times a negative is a positive 1. And then these two go together to make a positive 1. And then these two go together to make a positive 1. And if I were to multiply those three ones together, I'd end up with positive 1. Well, let's look at one more real quick. What if I gave you negative 1 times 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 negative 1? I added one more 1 to it. Well, again, these two give me a positive 1. These two give me a positive 1. These two give me a positive 1. And then this one is our negative 1. So now, if I were to multiply those together, these two give me a positive 1. But these two give me a what? They give me a negative 1. Thus, my final answer is negative 1. So what you find out is that when you're working these, you think about what a plus sign looks like. A positive is actually two pencil marks. It's a pencil mark this way and a pencil mark this way. So it's two pencil marks. So anytime I have two pencil marks like that right there, it's going to make a positive. Okay, so when you're dealing with more than two numbers, 3, 4, 5 numbers, all we have is two steps. We got step number 1, we multiply. Because if I were to take this and multiply all those ones together right there, I'd still get 1. And if we look at our integers, these two go together to make a positive. These two make a positive. These two make a positive. Anytime you have a pair of negatives, when multiply, it's going to make a positive. But if you've got this one little negative here left out in the cold that's all by itself, that one little negative makes the whole problem negative. Okay, so we've got two basic steps for multiply then. Step number 1, and this part I do need you to write down, so please make sure you write this down. Step number 1 is we're going to multiply our numbers just like always. Step number 2 is we're going to count our integer signs. All you got to do is count your negative signs. Count your negatives. We don't care about the positives. We only care about the negatives. So you count your negatives. If you have an even number of them, that means they all pair up. They all have a pair. And so it's going to become positive. But if you have that one left out, you have an odd number of negative signs, you're going to have that one negative left out. It's going to make the whole problem negative if it's all multiply. Okay? So let's see if we can do a couple questions. Okay, so pause the video, write these questions down and answer them for me. Okay, let's find out how you did. Now we know that another way of writing multiply is just to put parentheses like this. So this means 4 times negative 6. So step number 1, we multiply. 4 times 6 is 24. How many negative signs do you see? 1. So my answer is negative. Okay. Next question. 3 times 6 is 18. 18 times 2 is 36. How many negative signs do you see? 1, 2, 3. Well, these two make positive. This one here is left out in the cold, so it makes the whole thing negative. Okay, so let's look at this next one. 5 times 3 is 15. Times 2 is 30. Times 1 is 30. Now, how many negative signs do you see? 1, 2. So that means my answer is positive. Now, these two positive numbers, don't care about. We only care about negative signs. The negative ones are the only ones that can impact what we're doing. Okay? Now, this last one. And this last one says, negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1. That's what that problem says. And we say it one more time. Negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1. I messed up there. Okay, so what we do is, if we take all those ones and we put them together, we end up with 1 as an answer. Now we count our negative signs. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if there's 6, That means that's going to be a positive 1. And that's all there is to multiplying. 2 itty-bitty steps. Step number 1, multiply just like always. Step number 2, count only your negative signs. 1 negative makes it negative. 2 negatives make it positive. 3 negatives, well, the 2 make positive, but that 1's left out in the cold. Makes the whole thing negative. Okay, so kind of remember that. Now let's talk about division. Now division, we kind of do the same thing, but we need to talk about what division meant. Addition meant put together. Subtraction meant take apart or take away. Multiply was talking about groups of. Division is also kind of talking about groups of, and it's saying, here I've got 9 things. I want to divide them into groups of 3 or divide them into 3 groups. Either way. Okay, but what we're looking for is, what are the rules for this? I'm not going to take the time to actually do all the manipulatives, the integer chips and things like that. Basically, for division, we find out that the rules are exactly the same. I've got 9 divided by 3. More specifically, I've got 9 positives. I'm going to chop them into 3 groups or chop them into groups of 3. What am I going to end up in each group? And I'm going to end up with 3 positives in there. Okay, well, what if I had 9 negatives and I divided them up into groups of 3 or 3 groups? What would I have? Well, inside each of my groups, I'd end up with a negative 3. Well, what if I had 3 positives, but I wanted the opposite of each group? Well, the opposite would be a negative 3, right? And then lastly, what if I had 9 negatives, but I wanted to chop them up into the opposite of 3 groups? Okay, whatever's in that group, I want the opposite of that. Well, if I've got 9 negatives in there, the opposite of that's going to be a positive 3. So if you'll notice, the rule was the same. The chart would have been the same. A positive and a positive make positive. A negative and a positive make negative. A positive and a negative make a negative. And a negative and a negative make a positive. So the rules for division are exactly the same. So let's see if we can answer a couple division questions then real fast. So here I've got 25 divided by 5. Well, 25 divided by 5 gives me 5. How many negatives do you see? 1 negative. So my answer is negative. 45 divided by 9. Well, that's 5. How many negatives do you see? 1. So it becomes negative. 36 divided by 4. 9. How many negatives do you see? 2. So those 2 negatives make a positive. Now this next question is a little bit tougher because it deals with addition first and then division. So, and we have to do this addition first because it's in parentheses. So 26 plus negative 4. So we got to think back. Oh, what are my addition rules? Signs alike add, signs different subtract. So 26 take away 4 is going to give me a 22 divided by negative 11. So 22 divided by 11 gives me 2. And how many negatives do you see? 1. So it becomes a negative 2. Now another way of doing division is like a fraction. So all this problem here says is 54 divided by 6. We know that's 9. How many negatives do you see? 1. Okay? Now that's what we're looking at for multiply and divide. And we know there's basically 2 steps, 2 rules. And they're both the same for multiply and divide. Step number 1, multiply your numbers if it's a multiply problem. If it's a division problem, divide your numbers. And then step number 2, count your negative signs. If you have an even number of negative signs, your answer is positive. If you have an odd number, your answer is going to be negative. Now, the assignment that you're going to have today is going to be a form. It's a Google form. It's not really a form. It's a Google Doc. And I've created some columns in there. So all you're going to do, you'll see in one column, you'll see the problem. And in the other column, you're going to see a space for an answer. So all I want you to do is place an answer in there. So like this first one, we got negative 5 times 7. So 5 times 7 is 35. And you just need to make sure that it's negative. So you'll put that in that space available for you. Okay? So you got some problems here that are just easy problems here. All the dots mean multiply. When you come over here to the divide, those mean division. Okay? Now there are some word problems that you're going to have to do. So here are the word problems. Okay? So number 27 here is Mount Everest. The highest elevation in Asia is 29,028 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is the lowest. What's the difference in those? So you'll notice that these kind of questions here, they're not just multiply and divide. It kind of throws in all those integer rules so that you can kind of practice with word problems. Okay? So that's our lesson for today. So I'm hoping you understood what we were going to do with multiply and divide. Okay, so this assignment's going to be due on the same day as our test, on Thursday. So we need to make sure that we get that complete. It's a real simple assignment. Really easy to do, so you shouldn't have any problems with that. If you do, just send me an email. Okay, so until next time, I'll talk to you later.